Bueno, buenas tardes a todos los que estáis aquí y a los que están en casa siguiéndonos por YouTube. Y bueno, gracias por venir al seminario de abril, ¿no? Sí, de DAUCO. Este mes tenemos dos seminarios, esta semana tenemos uno y la semana que viene tendremos otro, porque teníamos dos profesores visitantes de fuera y vamos a aprovechar que están aquí. Y hoy va a ser todo en inglés, así que I'm going to switch to English. Hi everyone, if someone is listening us online. And yeah, today we have two researchers as usual, one from the house and another one from outside. And the first one is Ana Andreu. She's working in the department of agronomy with us with a contract of excellence from the Maria Maitsu Research Unit. And she will tell us about her work in integrating remote sensing and modeling in DSS. That has been the research line of Anna from 12 years almost now. So we are getting older now.
Yeah.
So Anna.
So hi, how are you? So I'm going to start talking about our work in semiárido sabana type systems, because it's also a way of introducing Timothy's work, like our work together. So semiárido sabana type systems are really complex and variable biomes on Earth. They are located in Mediterranean climates, so they are usually, they are water limited environments. So they are used to water stress, okay, they are used to drought. But the changes in climatic patterns, the increase in intensity of, and also other socioeconomic changes, for example, changes in agricultural practices, are actually making them more vulnerable. Okay, they are a mosaic of land uses. Like usually, livestock is the most important economic activity, but they also have agricultural or conservational uses. For example, in South Africa, this conservational use is really important. We also find them in California, or here in Spain, they are called dehesas, so in Portugal, montados. There's also this kind of savanna type systems in Greece and also in Australia. So what we want to do, or what we try to do, is help to improve, to try to make them less vulnerable with recommendations based on scientific and technical information. Okay, what we want is give information that is useful for management at different scales. Not just the regional one, for example, early drought alarm systems, but also in the plot scale, so in the farm. For example, with management of resources. Okay, so as I said before, these are they have a complex vegetation structure, so they have like different layers of vegetation. Like for example, this continuous grass layer, then isolated trees, but also scrubs and also very soil. They have different phenology. Like for example, grass is kind of like die after spring. Okay, they are annual, but trees are evergreen and transpiring for the whole year. They have also different physiology. These kind of species are used to water stress, so they evolve mechanisms to deal with the atmospheric water demand, okay, in summer, for example. And all these differences in function actually influence the ecosystem fluxes. So they influence how these different layers use water, for example, and also the vegetation dynamics or their CO2 fluxes. Okay. So they are really complex, and we can note like these different patches shape different microclimates that we can actually maintain or transform through agricultural practices. For example, through regeneration of trees. Trees are isolated, so that's good because that allows for the radiation to reach the soil, so that the grass layer can be there. But they also provide shadow in the summer for the animals. But they also change the soil humidity, for example, or the air and temperature, their temperature or humidity profile, or the wind profile. So, for example, the grass down the trees is actually it starts senescing later in the season. So we need actually to model or to monitor these systems, we need to consider the different components. Oh. So what we want is actually provide recommendations, okay, to improve management at different scales. And we try to do that also integrating Earth observation, so information from satellites and other sensors, okay, and also low-cost sensors. To do that, the first step is understanding how this ecosystem works, okay, so improving our knowledge about the flux exchanges, okay. I mean, we focus on water and also like vegetation dynamics. We also want to develop models, like we also want to know what is going to happen and what is happening, okay? Because with that, we can actually give information. And how we know how our ecosystem is working. So we take measurements, long-term measurements, okay, in the field, that we also use for validating the models, okay? So to follow the ecosystem, but also to validate the tools that we are developing. And I'm gonna start actually with the last point. I'm gonna talk about our different study areas. So basically we focus in three parts of the world. Like the first one is here, nearby Córdoba, in Los Pedroches. It's a dehesa, like Santa Clotilde. The second one is in South Africa, is the one that I work with Timothy. It's in Skukutsa, it's inside a natural park. And the third one is in the Californian rangelands, okay? These two are inside a worldwide, well, it's all over the world. There's a network that is measuring water. It's measuring actually with this kind of towers. So these are in the field. They are measuring water used by the ecosystem and also carbon fluxes, okay? They are measuring a lot of things, not just that. They are actually monitoring the ecosystem really well and the heterogeneity of these landscapes. For example, this is our dehesa in Córdoba. We have two towers, okay? This one and this one. The first one is really tall, it's 18 meters, and it's actually measuring water use and CO2 in a plume, okay? Usually you don't have like a point thing, you have a plume of measurements. I mean, it measures other things like the radiation that the plants can use to make photosynthesis, or the air humidity, or the rain. And then we have another one that is it's small, it's just like 2 meters, that is measuring just the pasture. Okay, I mean the pasture is interesting for us because it's what animals use to feed. I mean, we use the pasture to feed the animals. So usually these kinds of systems, like these savanna type semi-arid systems, have two different seasons. Okay, they have a wet season and a dry season with no precipitations and really high air temperatures. Okay, so this, I mean, this is spring. These blue dots are the water used by the vegetation or by the whole system. So in the spring we have a peak in water use because it's when the plants are actually growing and transpiring more. But this is summer. In summer there's also transpiration because the trees are still transpiring. Okay, so the trees are actually still alive. And then in winter and autumn, it really depends on the radiation. Okay, if there's enough sun to do things, they will. If there's not, they won't. This is the one in South Africa. So the vegetation is different, but they actually follow the same dynamics. Okay, and there's like droughts are also pretty common there. For example, in 2015, so this is the one that we were monitoring. In 2015, there was a really horrible drought, and a lot of animals actually died, like a lot of wild animals. And this one is the one in US. So in US, the trees are not evergreen, but they work kind of similarly. And they also have like long roots to use groundwater. And they have like a huge tower where we put like tons of things to try to understand how they change. So in this case, we actually installed a thermocamera. So it's measuring the temperatures of different things of the savanna, okay, like the trees, but also the soil, or the bare soil, because because actually temperatures exert fundamental controls over some plant-based processes like photosynthesis or transpiration or respiration. I mean, they really influence the growth of the plant, and then they really influence the fluxes changes in the whole system. Okay, so we wanted to assess the difference in between the different components. Okay, the different vegetation. Usually the satellite images give you you are just seeing the surface, but in this case with the camera you can have a profile, you can have a vertical profile. But as always, what we measure in the field is not the same as real truth, and we need to calibrate the images. So in this case, how can I explain this? So we are not black bodies, we don't absorb all radiation and then emit it perfectly. We are gray bodies, so we kind of have different efficiencies of energy emission, and we need to correct, and each component have different emissivity. So first, if we want to calibrate the image, we need to take that into account. But in our ecosystem, we also have mixed pixels. Okay, so for example, in the cameras, okay, in this case, you will have a pixel with information of the temperature from the tree, but also the temperature of the soil, of the bare soil. And for example, in summer, they are really different. So you will have a pixel that is not telling you the truth. Okay, it's an average that is false. So you need also to be careful with that. And there's also different distances from the photo. So the energy that the sensor is measuring is actually passing through different paths. Okay, so they are short or long depending on the distances. What we found is that actually in our with this we measure emissivity in our system, all the things are good emitters, so it was not so important. And the important thing were actually to really be careful with the mixed pixels. Okay, so we really need to kind of avoid these border effects. Okay, and really know what we are measuring. Yes. And what we actually, after doing all the pre-processing, what we found, which is kind of curious, is that in forest usually the top part of the trees are the warmer ones. Okay, because the sun is just reaching this part and nothing else down. But in savannas, because they are open, the bottom part of the trees is the one that are warmer, because the radiation is reaching the grass is reflecting and is also emitting temperature and is hitting the down parts. That also happens, for example, in olive trees. So this is actually a really good reason to don't take dry grass in summer, okay? Because dry grass actually can have 10 degrees less than bare soil. In summer, even if it's dry, the grass is actually cooling the environment. And yeah, that's basically. And we also saw that in between the satellite and in between these vertical temperatures, there is a match. Not always, but there is a match. And you can also study the different species. For example, pines and oaks kind of work the same, but obviously not grass. Yes. So in the system, you can also kind of easily just install usual cameras. Okay. Well, maybe these ones are RGB to study the dynamics of the vegetation. Okay. So for example, we want to know when the pasture is blooming, or we want to know when the pasture is starting to die. Okay. Also to see if that dates are varying depending on the changing of the climate patterns, and also the tree. Okay, we are really interested in the blooming of the tree because, the livestock pork, pigs actually eat these acorns, and blooming is related with acorn production. So with this camera, we did with Rafa, with this, and Pedro, I think too, no? Yes. With this camera, we can also see, we actually can see the blooming of the trees. Some years it's easier to see than others. In other years, the signal is actually much more noisy. And we can also see it for the pasture. Okay, and in the pasture, we could even see differences in plants. Like some flowers are white, some flowers are yellow. And you could see actually that in just with a simple RGB camera. And then we wanted to see if you can reproduce that with satellites. But of course, spatial resolution is important. So the satellite is giving you mixed pixels. So you cannot really separate the signal of the tree and of the pasture. Maybe with your satellite, well, probably, it's 5 meters, so maybe yes. So we need to be careful in this kind of system because they are heterogeneous. We also want to use this kind of information, not just the satellites, but also the one that we can measure in the field with low-cost sensors to kind of like feed models that are going to give us information about the water use. Okay, so how much water is the grass using or the trees using? Or how much water is the soil evaporating, which is not so good. And also about the biomass. So, I mean, about the vegetation dynamics, so how it's changing, but also about how much vegetation is producing, like how much pasture I'm gonna have to feed my animals in a bad year with a drought, for example. I mean, the models have different advantages and disadvantages. They usually use different information, and some of them need to be calibrated, and some of them don't. Some of them need soil information, like soil, like characteristic about the soil. Some others don't. But I mean, you cannot. The good thing is that you can also feed these models, feed a water use model with data from the camera, which was really cool because usually you just have like one estimation, okay, of water use by a whole pixel. But in this case, because you have the whole tree, and the tree is not actually homogeneous, like you have some parts of the tree that are warmer and they are more stressed. You have parts of the tree that are actually transpiring much better. So you could have a distribution, okay, of the whole system of how different parts of the system are actually working, which is interesting because it's an idea of uncertainty, okay, of our system. Yes. But then you can also have integrating remote sensing. You can also have information about, for example, the ESA area of Andalusia and how it's evolving and how it's using water, okay? And you can check which areas are more vulnerable or which farms are actually dealing better with droughts, for example. And you can always like use also pronósticos, like forecasting, in order to kind of like give the farmer information that is going to be useful for them to manage their farms. You can also, like with some models, then components, like for example, this black line is the soil. This line is the trees, like the green one, and the blue one is the grasses. So these are different savanna from all around the world. This one is the American one. This one is an Spanish one that is in Extremadura. And this one is also here. I'm not so sure exactly where. But you can see that actually the evaporation from the soil is kind of, this is a ratio, okay? It's a percentage, it's not. But it's actually important the whole year, okay? So we didn't know, I mean, we didn't know. It was not, for me, it was a surprise. Then you can also use it as a proxy for droughts. Okay, so with this, for example, you can compare how much water the ecosystem is using, like for real, and how much is supposed, how much, depending on the atmospheric conditions, is supposed to use. Okay, and then you will have a ratio of the amount of water that we are not giving them. Okay, and the good thing about this information is that it's also distributed. So, you can separate different, you can zonify, you can cluster different areas with different indexes of vulnerability, which is interesting to give information. And you can also check, for example, the recovery. This is the vegetation, the fractional cover of the trees. And you can see actually if they recover or don't recover, or how long they take to recover, okay? You can also check, this is grass, okay? And this is the same, like a ratio that is giving you the water stress. So this, for example, is a period where the grass started to need, it started to die. So it's interesting to know this date exactly, because it's gonna also influence supplement the farmers are gonna need for the animals. And we can also use it as a proxy of the soil humidity, okay? Like these kind of ratios. Because they also compare with how much water the plant is available, yeah, for the plant to. So, as I said before, like different models have different advantages, but the good thing is actually not use them all, because some of them are more complex than others, but no than others. So, for example, for us, if we want to use the model just to assess a regional drought index, we actually don't need to have a lot of information, like with a really high resolution, because we don't care. It's just a general index, okay? But if we want to know how much pasture is being produced, we do need really fine scales, okay? And for this, we will need at least meters. So when you are comparing models in a regional scale, they usually, all of them agree. If you are comparing them in heterogeneous patches, they don't. And then you need to be careful about, you always need to be careful about how you give the information with uncertainty and error, but yeah, you need to have surnames always. And this is what we tried to do in the South African savannah, like in the first time we collaborate, like Timothy and me, and it was actually assessing water stress with a combination of models. And we evaluated in a savannah that is actually inside the Kruger Park, which is a natural park. They also have like a really, really tall tower. And in this one, in the project that we are collaborating now, we actually we go a step further, and we want to actually compare or try to understand how the vegetation evolves in this kind of like drought-prone systems. So so we mostly use the European Space Ice Missions like Sentinel, although the first results are actually with MODIS because they are pretty easy. So and we also focus because there it's really a mosaic of land uses, so you actually have like crops. So it's really difficult to put that. They work differently, even if they are rain-fed like savannas. They are man-managed. It's not sort of rangeland, but actually a crop area. So we also wanted to include this. And for now, this is really like some preliminary results. What we've seen is actually that after this is a drought. This is measured in the tower, so this is measured in the field, okay. And we saw that after a big drought event, then we have a peak in grass production or in vegetation production. And we thought that maybe it's because there's a pool of nutrients in the system. Like when we leave the plots in barbecho, I don't know the translation of that. Like not, you don't.
Very soil, no?
Yeah, like you do nothing, and then the soil kind of rests, and then you have. And we want to see if we can reproduce that with the satellites, and we can actually. The production is similar to the ones that we found in Spain, and usually that happens like after a dry period. There's a blooming on vegetation production, and we also saw that obviously there's a correlation between rain and grass production, but it actually reaches a plateau. Like there's a point where more rain, and usually it's also that more rain means less radiation. So there's, even when the water is not the limiting factor, there's other factors. An experiment done here in Spain, in some farms in Los Pedroches. And we also see something similar, like after a drought, there is a peak in production. And I mean, this is useful because you can tell the farms, I mean, you can give them a range, okay? Like, okay, this is what you produce in a really bad year, this is what you produce in a good year, and this is the range where you can move, and this is the average. I mean, probably they already know that, but you can go really back with some of the satellite information. And the good thing about this info is also that you have it in a distributed way. So, I mean, there's always this kind of like the clustering things that are working the same, and you can decide why. Like, for example, we saw that the farms with a really high slope, they are usually less, I mean, that does make sense, but they are actually more prone to have like, to decrease their production more. Okay. Yeah, and then, I mean, the last or the final aim is actually understand how vegetation evolves in the face of drought, okay? And be able to deal with this kind of like water scarcity situations in advance and be prepared, because this is what's kind of coming. So, yeah, this is all. And thanks, because this was the work of a lot of people. Like, yeah, and thanks.
For the next presentation, I think, yeah, it's time for questions. ¿Alguna pregunta? Podemos hacerla en español si queréis. ¿Se anime alguien? ¿Alguien pregunta? Bueno, I have one, but I mean, I know. So, step regarding this integration of remote sensing and satellite. I mean, where we should go, like increase the resolution of the satellite, improve the models, or
I mean, I think like the first point is kind of like co-design these things with the final users. I mean, I think that's like, we don't care. I mean, even if the spatial resolution is improving and we have like more data everywhere, if the final users are not using this information, that doesn't, I mean, either, yeah. But I think it's difficult because there's always like this, I mean, I think linking science, policy, industry is difficult, and we still don't know exactly how to. But then, I had a supervisor that he was saying something like, we want, because there was always this question about, should I measure more different things, or should I just like leave the sensors there to measure longer the same thing? And the conclusion was like both. So, I mean, we need more spatial resolution, more time, and more models to combine. Yeah. So.
Juan, te hago la pregunta en español, que es el término que me cuesta dar. Nosotros estamos interesados en ver la radiación ultravioleta que llega a la superficie del suelo, porque creemos que puede determinar la velocidad a la que se desarrolla una epidemia, que algunos casos en el suelo. ¿Hay a monitorizar eso?
I mean, so he's asking me about ultraviolet radiation, but the thing is that, I mean, I mostly use visible, near-infrared, and thermal. I mean, I'm not so sure. I mean, Jesus, you've used, no, not at all, no. Sí.
Yes, I mean, I think I told you already, but I haven't said. Ultraviolet, I mean, a lot of the energy is absorbed by the atmosphere.
Yeah, it's not coming.
There is not a window there, but maybe there is some part of in which it's possible to measure it. But I don't know. I mean, this mission, I think that in Landsat 8 there is a band in the the blue edge. So maybe there is some connection there, but I don't know. I need to tell you that I will check. I have it.
No, but I don't think, I mean, ultraviolet and the atmosphere, they don't like each other, but maybe the sensors.
So some part of the ultraviolet radiation is coming, no? But it's not the whole spectrum. So sometimes for measuring from the space, you need like at least a wide range of energy to be able to measure it. But I don't know.
Consiste en mosas sin de campo y to monitor how the population of the pathogen is changing because they are more adaptive or not adaptive.
I mean, I know, like, for example, fluorescence, that is something that now, I mean, there's a new mission that is going to use. I mean, fluorescence was measured before in laboratory. Because also, I mean, I think it's not always about the spatial resolution or temporal, it's also about the sensitivity of the sensors. So for example, if not enough ultraviolet radiation is reaching, maybe for the sensor it's really difficult to actually measure these differences. But I don't know, like maybe there's field sensors.
Because it's also like, I mean, the sensor measure is not just, I mean, the radiation needs to come from the sun to the surface and then go back to the surface, from the surface to the satellite. So, I mean, I don't know. You know,
Me neither.
It's
To the ultraviolet. Not sure. And I don't know anyone that is actually working.
Yeah, because it's so important and everybody working in the plant.
Okay.
It's the most important part in describing the behavior of the pathogen in the soil.
Okay.
Would be interesting to.
I will check. And I mean, yeah. Andres,
You just briefly mentioned forecasting, but are you planning to integrate forecasting?
So I started with forecasting because of Rafa, because he's, I mean, he was working with the, can you say the name, please?
in Sweden.
In Sweden, yeah.
It's Mitchell.
Yes. So yes, but just like the next 6 months, like not long term, like not, yeah, not, I mean, it's forecasting, not climate change. But we think that maybe with 6 months, you can actually give some useful information, because you can have, for example, like next spring, and then they will know if it's gonna be like a bad or a, not a bad, yeah, if it's gonna be a bad year, if you are gonna have drought, yeah.
And we have started already, I mean, with a collaboration
Mm.
with and I mean, we are starting working with the temperature to connect it with the blooming. So I mean, we have started downloading information and we have done some bias adjustment, and I mean, it's a process ongoing.
But Maria said, like the
Yeah.
girl who is working in IFAPA also with the last slides were from her with this pasture production. I mean, he started also checking
Taking-
the relationship, not the relationship, like inside this range of farms that are working like in good and bad years, like you can kind of like, because it's always using indexes. So, okay, so this, I mean, it's like you always need to give information within certain, like it's a range.
We have started with temperature because it's, I mean, it's more easy to predict the 6 month period. I mean,
You know, because precipitation.
precipitation is always more complicated, and then stream flow, I mean,
We've been working mainly on rainfall, and it's quite difficult to forecast. 1 month in advance, maybe, but 1 month.
It's tricky.
Temperature, I don't know, but are you getting good results?
I mean, we have checked the scale with some, I mean, one cell here in the area that covered that, but the resolution is 35 kilometers per kilometer, and we have, but the scale is not so bad. I mean, with temperature, but not with precipitation.
But-
We haven't tried with precipitation.
Anyway, it's not like, I mean, it's really based on dry indexes and really like ranges. Like I mean, it's not detailed information. No, it's a way to go, like not really
No, but at least you can get information of if you're gonna have a dry or wet season,
that.
not like daily forecast. Also, you can, I think that could be quite useful for the study.
Okay.
You can tell the farmer that you're gonna have you can predict if it's gonna be a dry or wet season. Yeah, you are saying that you can get good results for 6 months in advance.
I mean, for the temperature is working, but I mean, it's also always easier.
But I think it's also a way, like a path to follow.
Yeah.
I think
I mean,
it makes
we are, it's a line that we are working in. Yeah. I think, venga, no,
Por dejar una inquietud más en esta complejidad, ¿no? De que que has presentado, que te están preguntando. La interacción con el animal es especialmente importante. Entonces, digo porque el escalamiento de la solución y de los modelos es bien importante tenerlo en cuenta, aunque sea.
And actually for pasture production is like...
La experimentación que hacemos nosotros, que estamos con collares
Sí.
de posicionamiento, y digo simplemente por dejar esa inquietud, ¿no? La mayor parte de la presión pastoral que hace de la carga animal que hay en los animales se concentra alrededor nada más del 30% del territorio. Entonces esto es bien importante a considerar porque todas las radiaciones, la directa, la perspectiva, es que cambia radicalmente, ¿no? Entonces,
Pero no solo eso.
simplemente dejar la inquietud en ese sentido, ¿no? Y luego a nosotros por lo menos nos va relativamente bien para solventar el problema de los píxeles mezcla, hacer un reconocimiento de objetos digitales, que pueden ser del PNOA, para
quitar bordes.
Para quitar bordes y contenidos. Por ejemplo, identificación de árboles, independientemente de la complejidad de la luz reflectada y especular en estas direcciones. Pero vamos, que ya bastante complejidad tiene la aproximación. Pero hay que...
Que el animal, a mí me parece que el animal, si el animal, por ejemplo, en el verano, debajo del árbol, o sea, es una compactación brutal con los animales, es donde se pueden relajarse. Creo que al final son cosas que es muy difícil meter en modelos. Pero bueno.
Thank you very much, Ana. Yes.
Thanks.
So we...
Lo siento. Que
No, gracias por venir. Igualmente.
So now it's turn for team Dube. Team Dube. Yes, sir. And I mean, he's professor at the University of Western Cape in South Africa. I mean, and he's an expert on remote sensing, and he will, talk about, how we use remote sensing for, understanding water resources and environmental management, and what are the implications for water security. Thank you, Timothy, for being here, and the floor is yours. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Rafa, and good afternoon to everyone. I think Rafa has done a good job by introducing myself. I wish I could have had the opportunity to do it myself, but that's fine. Like he said, my name is Timothy Dube from the University of Western Cape in South Africa. I will be giving a talk around the use of remote sensing in water resources.
Is the program with this?
Okay. All right. So I was still saying that I'll be giving a talk about remote sensing and its applications in water resources and environmental management, with a particular focus on the implications on water security, which is currently a major issue in South Africa and Southern Africa in particular. Water crisis is a big problem.
Is the arrow going down?
Down, yeah.
Okay.
It's weird.
Okay, so I will touch base on a number of aspects, particularly on the projects that we have been doing from a Western Cape perspective, but I think much of these, they sort of link to what Anna has just talked about. It's only that they are from different dimensions. So I will talk about groundwater dependent ecosystems in South Africa. Why are they important? Because as you know that South Africa is a very dry country, and there is an interest in finding out from the Department of Water Affairs and other related government departments on what is taking water from the system at what rate, so that they can enhance their planning. But also I'll talk about research on aquatic weeds, mainly from dams and rivers across the country. And I will talk about plant invasion, which is a serious problem across the country in South Africa, where they are sort of uptaking huge amounts of water from the system. And I will talk about water utilization in agriculture, then end by talking about the challenges associated with Earth observation and its applications in water resources management. So, if you look at the South Africa as a country, it's kind of characterized with a heterogeneous kind of environment or system with lots of dry parts across the country. You'll see as we move on to the other map. And we have areas some more moisture, so to say, of which in those areas water is not a problem. But almost 75% of the country is largely dry. So much of the water that is available there is from underground. And in these areas where we have got kind of these dominant plants, that's where we have got lots of biodiversity in terms of different plant species in those particular areas. And you find that these areas, they provide the habitat for wildlife and even peculiar sort of plant species in those areas. But the most interesting part is out of that biodiversity in terms of plant species, which ones rely on groundwater and which ones don't? And what are the implications if there is an exceeded kind of abstraction of groundwater from the system? What happens to the groundwater dependent plants? And if they die, what are the implications to the system? So you'll realize that these groundwater dependent ecosystems, they play a very big role, considering that South Africa is more of a developing country. And they act as tourism hotspots. For instance, if you go along the Cape Peninsula, you realize that there are lots of fine-bore species which attract lots of tourists. And once these systems are disturbed, the tourism aspect will sort of disappear somehow or be compromised. But more importantly, the biodiversity from a nature perspective slightly going to be sort of affected. And of late, we have realized that there is a lot of climate change that is taking place. Climate change, increased temperatures, droughts and stuff like that. And some of the critical plant species are sort of slowly disappearing, replaced by invasive plants. And these invasive plants, they take much water from the system. Hence, lots of research currently, or lots of funding is directed towards this kind of work across the country to understand how different aspects are sort of influencing these kind of systems. So far, some of the research that we have been doing, particularly in the country, is mainly towards the identification these areas that are predominantly associated with groundwater dependent ecosystems across the country, because that information is very key. The Department of Environmental Affairs is interested in coming up with an atlas to see where these groundwater dependent ecosystems are located so that they can be prioritized in terms of protection. And much of the research also is directed towards the hydrological systems within those ecosystems, but also the ecological functioning of them. What happens if temperature changes? What happens if rainfall variability becomes more and more even worse? But more importantly, the human factor. The population is growing, there is use for land, for settlement, for agriculture. What are the implications of such kind of activities on these groundwater dependent ecosystems? And what are the implications in the long run on the water resources in general and water security for the country. So you realize that various research institutions and government agencies have put lots of funding to support this kind of research across the country to ensure that they are sort of prioritized and protected. So these are some of the works that we have been doing in identifying and mapping groundwater dependent ecosystems across the country. Part of it, or much of this work, has been done together with postgraduate students, PhDs and master students, depending on the level. And majority of it has been centered around understanding this vegetation spatial heterogeneity within these groundwater dependent ecosystems, and also mainly to determine the key plant species which sort of depend on groundwater in those particular systems, as most of them are located in the dry system. So what happens, indicating some kind of this, how these systems sort of look like. So you realize that most of these groundwater dependent ecosystems are characterized by different plant species, depending on the water table or on the groundwater table in that particular area, or also as the characteristics of the aquifer that is available in that particular area. So you find that in most areas where the groundwater table is slightly close to the surface, you have lots of these bushes and some other indigenous trees, which sort of abstract much of the water. But most of the researchers you see as we proceed sort of indicates that the majority of these, they depend on the groundwater from the surface. And these shrubs, they sort of rely on the subsurface water with limited use of ground. And yes. So when we look at the, I'll try not to be too technical on the techniques out there working, but I'll just give a generic overview. So what you see here are some of the typical examples where these groundwater dependent ecosystems do okay. So you find some of them along rivers, along wetlands, springs, and seeps. And from our side, we have developed various methods and tools to sort of understand how these systems work and what happen occurrence in these systems. So we have different soil moisture sensors, which also where we kind of try to understand soil moisture variability over time within the system or within the catchment. Like we have several catchments where these have been installed for a long time. They've been collecting data for years to understand how soil moisture variability happens, but also more importantly, to see if these plants really depend on groundwater or they use subsurface flow, or when do they use surface water instead of groundwater, to understand those dynamics. So we have about 15 plants that have been installed with these catchment in southern tip of South Africa, which is around Cape Town. And they've been monitoring or collecting this data for the past, I think, 10 to 15 years or so. They are just shifted from one plant to the other, just to measure the subflows, to see how much moisture is being used by the plants. But based on that, where is that moisture coming from? Is it from the groundwater, or it's just from the subsurface? But also we do have use of satellite techniques, and we have a couple of edge coverance flux towers that have been installed in some of these systems or some of these catchments to understand water utilization patterns by some of these plants. One interesting thing mainly is that in most of these areas, you find that, like I said, most of these natural plants are now being replaced by invasive plants at a very fast rate. And the idea is to understand how invasive plants use in terms of water compared to natural systems, and what are the implications on the groundwater resources or water resources within the systems. And we have also a long-term data collection process that is occurring in some of these catchments for water quality to see, for instance, if invasive plants occupy this or invade these systems, what sort of effects do they have on the system in general? Is that have been done on the groundwater system to see how the groundwater varies in response to plants or groundwater dependent plants using the amount of water from the system. For instance, during the dry season, how much water is taken out of the system by some of these plants, and how much water is sort of, if let's say if there is a rainfall, how much water do they use, and do they see some of the variations in terms of the groundwater table. But what is interesting is that in some cases, the groundwater table is kind of very close to the surface. There's 1.5 in some of the network of boreholes around 28 in the catchment, drilled at different depth, and they have some kind of data loggers that collect information on the variations in terms of groundwater table. But also, these are linked to the systems that are monitoring plant water use, for instance, your subflow, to see, for instance, what happens if the groundwater table goes down during the dry season. What happens with the subflow measurements from plants? Do we see some kind of a relationship in those or what? But overall, what we have noted is that as the groundwater level decreases, plants kind of get strained, and those with the long taproots, they are the ones that kind of end up surviving during the process. But some of them, they do rely on the capillary action in some kind of the areas. I won't talk about this, but I'll just highlight some of the key areas where we have got sort of nationally recognized groundwater dependent systems across the country, like the Kruger National Park, wetlands. They are one of the key areas that are sort of designated as characterized key groundwater dependent ecosystem in Namibia and Zimbabwe. So it is one of the key areas. I think there's a number of projects that are happening there that are funded by the World Bank to understand how these groundwater dependent systems are doing, but the implications, because most of these areas are dry and they are largely provide services to rural communities and livestock, wildlife and livestock. So hence there is an interest towards much research in those areas. But some of the researchers are interested in understanding the carbon sequestration in these, mainly in these areas. And Limpopo, which is up north of South Africa towards Zimbabwe, Mozambique, these groundwater dependent systems are one of the key actually source of livelihoods for the rural communities that are in that part of the country. So this is a typical example of the Kakabray transboundary aquifer, which is located between South Africa and Botswana and partly Namibia. And as you can see, some of these, where they are located is quite dry, quite dry. The amount of rainfall received there sometimes is less than 300 mils per year. But most of them, they are always like this throughout the year, and they are very small with some kind of plants that are available there that are depending on. So why is the interest in research on groundwater dependent ecosystems? People talk about climate change, and a lot of research has been trying to prove that the real climate is changing. But also as it changes, what are the implications on these keystone ecosystems? But more importantly, there is an issue around land use change or land use change in terms of practices and pollution, over abstraction of groundwater. For instance, we have lots of mines, but also the rainfall patterns have been on the decrease over the years across the country, in most parts of the country. So now most of the agricultural activities, farming it's reliant on groundwater. So they abstract water from the ground. But now the government is interested in knowing how much does this affect these systems? What will happen in the next 10 years? Somebody was talking about forecasting. If the water is being taken from the system at this rate, what does it mean to these systems in the long run? So out of interest, there is a drive or some kind of a need to understand sort of the dynamics of how groundwater and surface water sort of interact within these systems. At which point do these plants use surface water? At which point do they use groundwater? And how much in terms of volumes between the two? It's very critical to understand those. I think that of much of the research trajectory that is taking place now, and also issues around the development of management strategies, but more importantly, assessing the impacts of climate change on these systems. This is very critical, but we need some kind of, should I say, the government is pushing towards a multidisciplinary approach in terms of research, instead of just using satellites only or algorithms only, but you need to bring human perspective, the social science aspect, because we can have these nice models and stuff like that. But what do they tell us? What do they mean to the person on the ground? So they are kind of pushing some kind of a multidisciplinary approach where you bring expertise from different fields to come up with some kind of a holistic understanding of this system. So another part that I'll be talking about now is an issue around aquatic weeds or aquatic weeds, plant species in the water bodies, for instance, in dams, rivers, and stuff. This is one of the major problems in the country, so to say. I think Anna can attest to that. If you check this dam, this gray part of it is mainly aquatic weeds that have covered the dam. You can see, and this dam, for instance, this dam is somewhere in Zim, and it's mainly used for recreation, fishing, and even supplying water to the city. But research has indicated that these plants, they take lots of water out of the system, and people end up suffering from water shortage within these kind of areas. So these are typical. This is a typical example of, for instance, is the Hartbeespoort Hoek Dam in Pretoria, South Africa. The green thing that you see from this satellite that was taken in 2018, it shows all this plant. As you can see how the river course is kind of polluted. And all these communities around here, they rely on their boats and stuff to kind of make a living. The year is the river course is like this, and these plants, they sort of affect their boats and stuff like that. And people are not willing to go there anymore because these plants are sort of an irritant to them. So you can see, so there is a drive from a research perspective to say, we have to sort of come up with a clear picture, effective, to say which areas are affected by these plants and what sort of mechanism can be put in place to sort of control them. But also, like I said, from a multidisciplinary perspective, because these plants are as a result of the farming activities that are happening within the catchment that serves these kind of dams. So how best can we involve farmers who are on the area to say what can be done to resolve this, instead of leaving this problem to the government? So this is the major challenge. But from an Earth observation perspective, the major challenge that we have been finding is that how do you differentiate between these plants and other co-occurring plants such as grasses, riverine vegetation? Also the issue of scale. We find that some of the rivers are very narrow, as you can see from that part. And most of the data that is available, because this is a national issue, so you need mapping at a national scale. And most of the data that is available at a coarse resolution. So how do you use it to pick such kind of the occurrence of these plants. That's a major challenge, actually. But then the issue of spectral separability or the issues around spectral mixing that Anna has been talking about, it's quite a challenge. Then the other one, which I find very interesting, and the government of Western Cape Town, so to say, is interested in this because invasive plant species, they are growing at a very fast rate across the country, especially in areas they call water towers, areas that they provide water to the city or the country, so to say. The invasive plants are growing at a very fast rate. As you can see from this map, this is part of the Cape Town is somewhere. If you look at, so I'm making a mistake. Yeah, Cape Town is somewhere here. But if you look at this red part, this shows invasive plants, what they call Acacia longifolia. And these plants have been found to use lots of water, and they are replacing fynbos, which is one of the keystone plants in the system. So the government has introduced what they call working for water. They want to prioritize clearing of this, removing these plant species, but they need this information to know what kind of plant species are in the system, which ones use more water, and which ones use less, so that when they clear, they prioritize. They take away the ones that use more water from the system very quickly, and allow the system to sort of recover. But just this map, for instance, if you can see these maps, it is just a small part of, sorry. It is just a small part of this particular area here. ET, evapotranspiration from the system. So you'll realize that from areas where we have these lots of invasive species, you can tell the what you call it, the amount of water that is being taken from the system is quite different. If you look at this table below, annual actual evapotranspiration, you can see how much water is taken from the system by most of these invasive species compared to natural plant systems that occur in the system, hence the need to sort of prioritize. So this is kind of a long-term kind of actual ET demonstration over the years to see how much these plants use from these kind of systems. Then this is one of the projects that we are currently working on, which is funded by the government of South Africa through the National Research Foundation. They are interested in knowing, like I said, the country is going drier and drier, and farmers are using groundwater for irrigation. But you'll find that on the system from the government records, farmers, they say they farm relying on rainwater. You get it? But because the farm is located somewhere remotely there, they drill a borehole, they don't report to the government, and they irrigate. But on the system, they say they use rain-fed. So the government is interested to knowing what are the farms that are available in the country, how many of those are irrigating, and how many of those are using rain-fed. And how do they pick them? They use satellite data, especially during the dry season. They know that the system is dry, and not anything green from an agriculture perspective, it uses somewhere there's some form of irrigation. So that's what we are working on from this perspective, although it's a big challenge because of the data issues and some of the stuff that I'll talk about sooner or later. So this is part of the work that we have been able to do for some parts of the country, just to test it to see if our techniques can be able to pick some of these farms without mixing them with the natural systems. But as we can see, you can see that there's some kind of closeness between what the satellites can pick and what is on the actual ground. Okay, this is the preliminary, or should I say the provisional map that was produced for all the farming areas across the country, South Africa. As you can see, the red ones indicate the ones that are irrigated from the system, and the light, should I say greenish, are the ones that are rain-fed. But now the issue is, we have validated some of these systems, but we are still trying to move across the country to see what the satellite does. Is it actually what is on the ground? Because sometimes you may accuse farmers of irrigating while they are not irrigating. So those are some of the issues. So this is the sort of the kind of distribution of farming within the country per province or per region, so to say. So you can stand the regions where there is too much kind of irrigation, Free State, and Eastern Cape, which is the central part of the country, and the southern tip part of the country, southeastern tip of the country. That's where there are lots of kind of irrigation systems that are available from that map. So what are the challenges that we have been experiencing from our side? I'm almost coming to an end. You realize that because much of this work is done at a large scale, you can't use drones or whatever to do the mapping for the whole country, as you can imagine how big it is. So much of these data sets that we have, like the Sentinel one that Anna was talking about, it's good, it's available at 10-meter resolution, 20, depending on the regions of the data that we are using. But the major challenge that we have is mainly the cloud cover in some parts of the country, which makes it very difficult to pick some of these, be it invasive plants or irrigated areas. And there are issues of scale also, computational power, that's a big challenge. You can imagine how big the country is. And to validate the entire country takes a lot of resources for one to move from one corner to the other. Who funds that? At what cost? So those are some of the issues that we realized. And there are issues of data volume so huge. Some of these computers are not compatible with this kind of data. They sort of run out of thing in the processing power. But also there is an issue of spectral mixing, because some of these farms are kind of very small older farmers, but also rivers, some of the rivers are very narrow from an invasive species perspective, but also from a savanna perspective. Yes, savanna is characterized by sparse vegetation with a continuous layer of grasslands, but in some cases where there are rivers, where soil moisture is available, you find that the system is a bit different. So this kind of data sometimes gives problems in those particular areas. So what is being done so far from a scientific perspective, from a data challenge perspective, from a processing challenge perspective, people have been sort of recommending the use of these cloud computing systems where you don't have to download these data sets, but just process them from the cloud, as you can imagine. So those are some of the things that have been done. But also, one key aspect has been to come up with what they call citizen science, involve community, whatever research that you are doing in every locality. If there are people in area A, talk to them and allow them to do the data collection in those areas. So from my side, that's the end of the presentation. I'm not sure if there are any questions.
Thank you very much. Any question? Anna?
So the invasive species, so you've seen that actually they use more water, no? So they are less used drought, but they use more water. And where I mean, that was the question. They use more water. And the other question is like, where they come from? Like they are from other countries? Or...
Yeah, what happens is some of these plants were introduced long back. You know, when people, they brought them as maybe to, in some areas they are sand dunes. So they brought them to put them on the sand dunes to stop the wind from moving. But they didn't know that they're invasive. So with time, they started spreading across. Some people brought them as ornaments, flowers in their yards or in farms to demarcate. But now they are spreading in some areas. They are going to the natural ecosystem. So that's where the challenge is. But secondly, on the amount of water that is used, we have realized that most of these invasive plants, they use more water or should I say double the amount of water compared to plants that occur there naturally. You get it? And some of them, they've got long taproots, unlike the indigenous plants. So if it's dry, they go even deeper and take water out of the system. Hence, the government has put so much amount of money to locate them and remove them from the system. And to make it clear to you, some farmers have even abandoned their farms because of these plants, to say you can't manage them, they are very difficult, they take much water out of the system, and they grow very fast. You remove them today, after 3 months, they are back like bushes.
Yeah, to ask you, how are you trying to solve the problem of spectral mixing, pixel level, when you have different layers of grass and trees? How are you trying to solve that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, actually. In most cases, in some areas where we have such kind of problems, we either use high resolution data, like for instance, we have data from world view, which is very high, especially if the areas where we experience that are kind of areas of interest from a research perspective, then we compensate that by high resolution. But the major challenge with high resolution is that it doesn't have long-term, should I say, temporal coverage. It's just a snapshot, because they take images when you pay, so they don't have anything if there's no funds. But also there are some of the ways of trying even to go beyond, to use texture from some of these images to kind of dissect the radiometric kind of the image info, to do this kind of analysis using the texture properties.
Education of the cloud cover, you try to use radar data to assess.
Radar, but the major challenge with the radar that is freely available, most of it, the resolution is quite coarse. And like you know that what she was saying, the system is heterogeneous. So in some cases, it even makes it worse, it's kind of spectral mixing vis-a-vis the pixel size of the radar data. So that's where the challenge is. But from a soil moisture perspective, it's been applied. From a biomass perspective, it has been applied in the Kruger National Park for some time. But from an invasive species, we haven't done any of such.
Question. I just have one quick one. Have you tried to use grace for the groundwater to,
Yes.
Okay, and
Yeah.
and it work? The resolution is really high, but
We
no, the opposite low.
very coarse, yes. We used the grace for groundwater estimation, but so far we haven't done it at national country level, but we have just done it for some selected aquifers of interest, especially in municipalities where the government are finding it very difficult to sort of provide water to the communities due to increased drought. So we've used it to try and identify certain aquifers that have got a good water sort of availability, or in terms of recharge or whatever you can think about. So we have applied it. For instance, there is an area called the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan, where water crisis is a problem, are always empty and people are struggling with water. So there are projects that are working on that, where they're trying to sort of identify, or should I say, they call it finding new water of some sort.
So thank you very much, Tim, Anna, and thank you very much, all of you, for coming here. And the people at home, I don't know if there is someone or not. And next week we have another seminar, because this week we have to invite the researcher from. So I hope to see you all next week here at the same time, the same. Okay, see you.